Dr. Lara Fergus, who doesn't want to be introduced, has extensive experience in the area of violence against women. Lara's past experience includes consultant, strategic research and policy development and violence against women in Europe, the Asia Pacific region and Australia, expert advisor in violence against women, section UN, program manager and senior policy officer, prevention of violence against women, Victorian Office of Women's Policy, researcher, Stop Violence Against Women campaign, Amnesty International Australia, acting coordinator, senior research fellow and research officer of the Australian Centre for the Study of Sexual Assault. She's a big deal. She hates to be introduced, so I make sure I read her entire bio. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Lara Fergus.
Yeah. And thank you, Nellie. And Nellie tells me she's introduced me before and seen me present before, and I always go long, apparently, always without cut. So I'm going to try and speed it up. I will start though by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to elders past and present, and any elders who are in the room. And I'd also like to thank DBRCV and Community Childcare Association of Victoria, the NAB and the Department of Education for all the support to this event and for inviting me today. So, does it work? Yes, it does. Okay, today's presentation from me, that is to take you through what we know about the evidence base on violence against women and its prevention. So I work at an organisation called Our Watch, which I'll present to you very briefly, then talk about what the international evidence tells us on this issue, which we put together in a framework called Change the Story just last year, and touch on a little what this means for the early childhood education and care sector. Of course, that's the whole work of today, so I'll just sort of introduce that particular part. So Our Watch, just very briefly, we were established just a few years ago as the National Foundation to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children. We're funded by government, particularly Commonwealth and Victorian governments established us, and many other state and territory governments have now joined. We focus on what's called the primary prevention of violence against women and their children. Emily touched on this in her presentation, but I suppose it's looking at the work in this area in through three main approaches. And primary prevention refers to the body of work that looks at how we can actually shift the culture, the attitudes, the behaviours, structures and practices that are contributing to violence in the first place. That is, how can we change the whole society we live in so that violence becomes unthinkable, so that violence becomes something that doesn't happen in our societies, in our communities, in our organisations. So it's very much a sort of set of strategies, if you like, that focus on social change or organisational change or institutional change. And I just wanted to make that clarification because I think it interacts with work that responds to existing violence, like service provision, the sort of reporting that in your work you'll be obligated to do that Janet took us through. And early intervention work, which aims to sort of identify risks and work with children and families at risk. But the work of my organisation and the work I'm talking about today is not about that part of things. It's about the cultural and social change that we're looking at. So the sort of examples of work that Our Watch does, for example, we do a social marketing or social media campaign with young people aged 12 to 20 called The Line. We do work in schools, particularly in Victoria in secondary schools, and we're now moving into primary schools at the national level. We do a whole series of work with national sporting organisations, with workplaces, and with the media. And we're wanting to sort of look more into the area of how we can work with the early childhood education and care sector and see if there's a way we can find ways to link up our different agendas and work areas. I won't play this video now because I'm worried about going on. But there's a video on our website, and there's a whole lot of other resources on our website from what I've just talked about. What I will focus on today is Change the Story, which, as I said, is a framework we developed with Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety and with Vic Health last year, that reviewed all of the international evidence to date. Basically thousands of studies around the world that looked at the different factors that correlated with high levels of violence against women in different societies or communities, and looked at the effectiveness of different strategies prevent violence or reduce its occurrence. And we took that research to consultations around the country, and we consulted with over 400 stakeholders around the country to sort of frame it into a shared document that we could work from. And we like to refer to it as a sort of roadmap that we can use across sectors to build partnerships and a shared understanding of the issue and how we prevent it. Okay, so what did we learn? In a nutshell, we learned from our review of the international evidence that violence against women, no one here will be surprised, is a complex problem. There's no single cause. You can't point to this thing and say, stop this thing and we'll end violence. It needs a complex approach to addressing it, but it is one that can be prevented. So just as we've seen public health campaigns and other social change initiatives that have significantly shifted prevalence of particularly harmful behaviours or health problems like smoking, like dangerous driving and road safety, so too can we apply sort of similar techniques and similar approaches to reduce future occurrences of violence against women. And that's what we're trying to do through Change the Story. So I won't talk about the impacts because I think Emily covered that really well. And I won't go into too much detail either on the gendered nature of violence. Emily covered that really well too. But I think I will just pause to take a moment. The very gendered nature of violence per se, not just intimate partner violence and sexual violence, but violence per se in our community means that we can't shy away from a discussion of gender. And that's a really hard thing. It's often the bane of our lives for those of us working in this sector because it's a really difficult thing to discuss. And of course it doesn't mean that we're saying all men are violent. Of course it doesn't mean that we're saying women are never violent. Of course it doesn't mean that all violence isn't wrong and that we shouldn't be responding and respecting and listening to the voices of all of those who experience violence. But when we look at these sorts of facts and these sorts of statistics, particularly the perpetration statistics, that 95% of all violence, whether it's committed against men or against women, is committed by men. We have to, as Emily said, look at this idea about how we are in particular bringing up boys, how we are constructing masculinity, and how we are excusing or condoning certain behaviours in a very gendered way. If we don't do that, we're not going to get anywhere. We're simply tinkering around the edges. It's to not talk about gender in a discussion of violence against women or family violence. It's like not talking about smoking in a discussion of lung cancer. We're just ignoring the biggest single factor that there is. So how, though, does gender and gender inequality affect violence against women or drive violence against women? We know from the international evidence and have known for some time that there is an impact at the societal level. I don't know what that is. For example, we've seen in numerous sort of multi-country studies have shown that when you have higher levels of gender inequality in laws and institutions, in practices, you will also have higher levels of violence against women. That's been known for about a decade now. A criticism that's often levied at that is, but maybe that's to do with GDP, the general economic development of the country, or maybe it's to do with rule of law or levels of democracy or these other sort of macro factors. And that's a reasonable sort of criticism. But most recently there was a really landmark study in the medical journal The Lancet in 2015 that did a multivariate analysis on all of these different factors and compared all of these different factors and took into account things like GDP, rule of law, democracy, and still found that the single biggest, most significant and most consistent variable was gender inequality across 44 countries. So gender inequality accurately predicted levels or higher levels of intimate partner violence in countries without even taking into account any other one of those factors, or rather with taking into account any of those other factors and factoring in for them. Okay, and that's true at the societal level, but there are also, I suppose, a number of studies that show that filters down through the community and the organisation and even to the individual level. So we know that, and this is from Australian research itself, the National Survey of Community Attitudes to Violence Against Women, that individuals, and this is men and women, who don't believe that men and women are equal, who believe they have different roles, different particularly in relationships, or different characteristics that are somehow inherent to being male or to being female. These people are more likely to condone or excuse or to justify violence against women. And for men as individuals, the most consistent predictor of their support for violence against women and the most consistent predictor for their perpetration of violence against women is their adherence to sexist and sexually hostile attitudes. There's a great video on this on the Vic Health website, which again I won't play for time reasons, that sort of distills the findings of the National Community Attitudes Survey and shows how these particular attitudes are correlated with or driving these different driving violence against women. So where the international consensus has now landed quite firmly is that gender inequality is the leading driver of violence against women. But what does that mean? Obviously, it's not a simple thing of like if we get more women on boards or even if we get more women into Parliament, suddenly there'll be no violence against women. It doesn't work like that. But it's gender inequality in all of its dimensions sets the social context in which this very gendered phenomenon of violence occurs. So the UN calls it quite squarely the root cause of violence against women. In Change the Story, we've called it, we've talked about it as setting the social context to try and sort of tease that out a bit. But the assumption is if we could suddenly eliminate all forms of gender inequality tomorrow, would we still have violence is the question. If you think back to those sorts of perpetration statistics, probably not so much. We wouldn't be constructing masculinity in this same way. Arguably all violence, if we eliminated gender inequality, all violence would be reduced because we wouldn't be constructing masculinity as somehow inherently aggressive or violent. And certainly we wouldn't be seeing those gendered patterns of violence where women are more likely to experience the controlling behaviours, the intimate partner violence and the sexual violence that I think Emily referred to in her presentation. But as I said, it's not a simple thing. It's not a quick fix about representation or any other sort of anything like that. We've got to think about how gender inequality operates at all these different levels of society. I won't go into detail on that because I'm sure as early childhood educators you're really familiar with these sort of socio-ecological models of understanding human behaviour. That human behaviour doesn't exist in a vacuum, it's influenced and developed in a community and social context, and that there are social structures which influence what we believe, and in turn what we believe influences our social structures. And so the structures, norms and practices around all these levels of society are, if you like, the channels through which inequality and the sort of messages that excuse and justify violence are transmitted. So we've tried to pull this. How am I going for time? I'm about halfway.
Little over.
Was it? So can I show the video? I think. Is that right? Now, I'll have to do something. We've tried to pull a lot of that complexity together. I've really tried to talk quickly through it. Apologies, but we've tried to pull it together. All right. So you can imagine how great that video was. Okay, the other thing we did in Change the Story, I've hinted at the fact that gender inequality is a complex concept and it's difficult to understand. One of the things we discovered when we did review the evidence for Change the Story that has evolved in particular over the last 10 years is that there are particular expressions of gender inequality that have a particularly high impact on levels of violence against women. So when I say getting more women on boards is not necessarily going to help things, it's because that's not necessarily one of the things that's been found correlated with high levels of violence against women across countries. But some things have been. And I don't know, this is not very easy to read, so apologies, it's cut directly from Change the Story. It's these particular 4 factors that significantly, consistently drive high levels of violence against women across the world. The condoning of violence against women is the most obvious one. So behaviours, attitudes, practices that excuse, that justify, that tolerate, that fund, that blame the victim for violence, all of those sorts of factors. If you like, they're the tip of the iceberg and they're the things we hear it's the Eddie Maguire factor. You know, that's his comment about it being very funny to drown a woman. That's a condoning of violence against women made visible, and we can usually recognise it when we see it. At least most of us can usually recognise it when we see it. But there are these three other factors that will have as equal an impact on levels of violence. Men's control of decision making and limits to women's independence. It's really obvious that in private life that's really obvious. In relationships we can understand that, and Emily talked quite in some detail about controlling behaviours and coercive behaviours. But that's also true in public life in the evidence, where men are those that are considered the ones that we go to for final decisions on things, when women are not considered reliable, or their opinions are considered of lesser value or interest. You'll have high levels of violence against women. Rigid adherence to gender stereotypes and rigid gender roles and constructions of masculinity and femininity as well. And an obvious example of that is the don't be a girl sort of comments to boys that encourage aggression and violence, and they've got to protect women, and they've got to be strong, they've got to be in control, they've got to stand up for themselves, particularly those constructions. And also more recently, male-female relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect towards women. That's some more recent research that has come out, and it's got to do with male behaviour in peer groups, or male behaviour in peer groups. Obviously, peer groups can be a source of great support to men and friendships and so forth, but where you have a particular sort of quite toxic culture where to be one of the boys you have to disrespect women, or you have to make hostile comments to women. We've seen it in a few AFL clubs and environments like that. That's quite a dangerous mix, and that is associated with a high risk of perpetration and high levels of violence against women. These are the things that consistently and significantly drive violence against women, those 4 factors down there. There are a number of other factors that can interact with those, or when they come into contact with those particularly gendered or sexually hostile norms and structures and practices, that can exacerbate violence or make it worse. And a really obvious one is alcohol. So if you think women and men are equal, and you never think violence is acceptable, and you treat people with respect, if you drink, you're not likely to suddenly become ragingly violent. It does not work like that. But if you already think that you have the right to or should be dominating your partner, if you think that your aggressive behaviour is excused, and that you as a man are more valuable than your partner, and you drink, then violence can get a lot worse under those circumstances. And we've got quite solid data now that it can exacerbate and increase the frequency of violence against women in those circumstances. But importantly, it's only in the context of those gendered attitudes and norms. The same is true, and I'll just quickly skim over this, the same is true of some of these other factors. Socioeconomic disadvantage works in a similar way. I will touch on very quickly the experience of violence, and the experience in particular of violence as a child, whether witnessing violence against your mother or whether the direct experience of abuse. You will all know really well, and better than me, the sort of cumulative negative impacts that has on children. It has again been associated with a high risk of perpetration of violence against women in boys, but that is by no means an inevitable pathway, and we've really got to be careful about pathologising children who experience violence. It has much more to do with providing them with a developmentally healthy environment, providing them with alternative relationship models, and the work that you do, and work like respectful relationships education, can make all the difference there. And I think Janet explained that really well this morning. So to wrap up on the evidence, we basically distilled a number of factors. Those on the left that are really significant and consistent, those on the right that are called reinforcing factors, that when they come into play with those on the left have an impact on violence against women. And all of these together, the research is really clear, mean higher probability of violence against women. It's a probability-based model. It's never like this thing leads through a pathway to this form of violence, but on a population level, on a probability level, these things all lead to a higher probability of violence against women. So, very simply, we can address these factors, and we can by addressing these factors consistently and in a coordinated way with what we know to be effective prevention strategies, we can lower the probability of violence against women. And that's what primary prevention is. That's what I mean when I say it's a social approach. So this isn't about necessarily working with individuals, but there are social activities that can be undertaken to address all of those factors and lower the probability. And so we've aligned these with the drivers and reinforcing factors that I just showed you. It's things like challenging the condoning of violence against women, promoting women's independence and decision making in public life and in relationships. And we could add girls to that, women's and girls. Fostering positive personal identities and challenging gender stereotypes and roles, strengthening positive, equal and respectful relations between and among women and men, girls and boys, and promoting and normalising gender equality in public and private life. And then there's a lot of partnership work that can be done to support that with the sectors of, say, child protection, those working on alcohol abuse, those working on social development. Okay, so, and Change the Story presents, you know, a number of sort of techniques and approaches that can be used across different settings, and it promotes a sort of coordinated approach at different levels and across these different settings to undertake all those actions on the previous slide and work towards a reduction of violence against women. What does this mean for the early childhood education and care sector? Well, look, prevention is about a life course approach. So it's about making sure we are creating environments, organisational environments and social environments and family environments in which all children and young people are growing up in positive, equitable and non-violent ways, where they're participating in education and care environments that promote equality, that build respect for relationship skills, and that also respond effectively to those that are at risk of or experiencing violence. And that all children and young people are involved in creating non-violent and equitable futures for themselves and for their societies. Because ultimately this is a future-focused sort of work. It's an intergenerational form of work that we're undertaking with primary prevention. So working with children and making sure that children have a voice and a stake in this is really important. So Change the Story recognises the potential for working in early childhood settings. We know that early childhood education and care plays an important role in socialisation and cognitive and emotional development of children and young people. And we also notice that as a setting you open up the possibility for a lot of stronger partnerships with what we call common cause agendas or shared agendas such as child protection. Okay, and we've also got these wonderful frameworks, the National Quality Framework in particular and the Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework, which are closely aligned with a lot of those objectives that I just mentioned of promoting positive and equal environments for children to grow up in, creating positive non-stereotypical personal identities, all of those sorts of things. And there are particular ways, I think, in which early childhood education and care can work with kids because, of course, you're not going to want to go into some sort of detailed conversation on family violence with children, and no one's sort of suggesting anything like that. But you do have this really key role to play in doing some of these things, like promoting girls' independence and decision making, and challenging gender stereotypes and roles in particular. We do know that research shows that gender stereotypes start to become ingrained really early on in kids. And I did have another video to show here to end with, which I won't try and do, called Redraw the Balance. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you have a look at it. It's a British video and initiative, and I think it's working with children in primary schools, or early primary schools, not early childhood. But it very effectively demonstrates the way these kids really are already holding a lot of gender stereotypes in their understanding of the world and how we can address that. All right, how to go?
So this pair